Hello, everyone. Yes, Miriam, we can start the live transmission on YouTube. So thanks to the CISAN for hosting the session. We are live on YouTube. I'm always excited to say that. It sounds like we scholars are like media people. I'm very happy to start this new year with this seminar. It's the first session of the year, and we'll have many more throughout the year. Especially because today we're going to explore a new theme, a new area of research about the night, especially with the work of Linda, which is education, which is a very, I think, interesting topic in related to the night, especially because, as we all know, the night is mainly related to parties, to the crime, and in this seminar we try to go beyond that. And I guess education is very could be a very interesting topic. Actually, this morning I was listening to the radio, a podcast about Paris 8 Vincennes, which was an experimental university in France, started in the 1968, and there were night courses, which was very new at the time. And I don't know, I guess it's also part of this experimentation that we had in France at the time. And I hope we can maybe talk about that a little bit more with Linda. And so Linda will be our first speaker today. She is a clinical associate professor at the Department of Economics at Baylor University in the United States. Our second speaker today is Professor Nick Dunn at the Lancaster Institute for the Contemporary Arts at Lancaster University. We will have both speeches. Both of them will be around 20 minutes, and that's it pretty much. What I wanted to say about the seminar also is that we recently joined the International Night Studies Network. I'll put the link in the chat. Basically, this network, as I said in the email that I sent to all our contacts, is a tool for the promotion of our events, activities. So feel free to join the network. You'll have access to the mailing lists also, and you can participate in many activities. So thank you for being here. Well, Linda, please, you can start and have a wonderful seminar to everyone.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and for the introductions as well, because I'm brand new to the concept of night studies, and have, at least through perusing some of the work that is referenced in the blog, and that I know that many of the members in the network engage in, I think that I'm very excited to hear about maybe some of your ideas about work that I undertook, not really with the lens of night studies per se, but I think there are strong connections to that. So I am so thankful for all the work that goes into organizing this, and the honor of presenting. So please, I'm anxious to hear about your thoughts about any connections between night studies in general and this work. So I'm going to share my screen here and put together some slides that will help me stay focused. So scholars have made a great deal of progress in understanding the progression of the public education movement in the US in the first part of the 19th century, and the impact of compulsory schooling laws and child labor laws in the late 19th century and early. Project complements that body of work by looking at a complementary feature of the education movement, namely widespread efforts to help children to combine their work and schooling by offering evening instruction. So to document the progression of evening school movement and analyze the impacts that these schools had, I bring together a great deal of primary sources, primary records from school systems, from factory inspection, labor inspectors, lots of information from the census, and try to pull it together to add to this story about evening schools. So even though it's not the focus of my work, I think a bit of context is helpful. In the US, we can trace the origins of fee-based private schools in the evening back as early as 1661 in what would later become New York. So the rise of free evening schools was really concentrated in the 19th century, though. In the 1800s, amidst industrialization and rapid urbanization, there was growing concern for children missing out on their educational opportunities. Sometimes this was because of work or household responsibilities during the day. And these concerns were especially relevant in light of public discourse about the importance of schooling for moral development and the success of a viable democracy. This was the narrative that was being discussed at the time. And there was also new evidence that pointed towards a connection between a lack of education and crime. So there was a lot of concern about the perpetuation of illiteracy and the impacts that would have on society, in particular crime. So churches, philanthropists, education activists started offering opportunities for poor working class children to attend school in the evening. And it's kind of surprising, but factory owners, the employers of the children, mill operators, they also started offering night schools either in the factories themselves or nearby. And you would see this happen whenever a child labor law was passed. It would presumably be to comply with the law without disrupting production. Or maybe even to prevent the strict enactment of child labor or compulsory schooling legislation. We start to see public evening schools arise in the 1830s in New York, Rhode Island, and surprisingly Kentucky, which is a southern state not necessarily known for being an innovator in education policy. So that free public evening schools, that's the focus of my work. So these schools were established almost entirely in urban areas, and they usually used the existing school buildings as another shift of schooling, essentially for a different group of students. They would operate in the classrooms or sometimes even the basements of these schools. The teachers were moonlighters, is the kind of pun here. They would teach in the day schools, but then they would come and teach another group of students in the nights. Some places would not allow that and would have to recruit primarily new graduates from teaching school. Education was very decentralized in the US, and so there's tremendous variation in the details of these schools. Across cities and even within a city, the different schools would operate very differently. So the schedule was usually 3 to 5 evenings per week, and the meeting would be 2 to 4 hours. There was a lot of variation even in the number of evenings that schools would meet. So if I take 3 cities in one state, one might operate for 50 evenings, one might operate for 100, and another might operate for 180 evenings. So lots of variation. Initially, the educators were reluctant to establish evening schools for girls. They were really targeting boys. There was concern about the safety of the girls attending at night. This kind of speaks to that negative connotation of night. There was concern about maybe gossip happening or their reputation being sullied if they're out gallivanting in town overnight or throughout the night. And there was also less worry about the girls engaging in bad behavior in the evening. So if we were trying to prevent boys from congregating, from engaging in criminal activity, that was much less of a concern from a social perspective for girls. Some cities experimented with providing evening schools for girls, and where they did, they were very successful. The girls attended, they focused, they were very serious about their studies. And so that encouraged the development of schools for girls as a widespread offering as well. There were two types of evening schools that were part of the public school system. The elementary schools were very focused on the fundamentals of reading, writing, arithmetic, and English for non-native speakers. Later in the 19th century, though, evening high schools developed for students that had finished their basic schooling. This was a much broader curriculum. The schools would have subjects like German, astronomy, chemistry, mechanical drawing, for example, and this drew a broader attendance. So even some of the children from middle-class families would attend, and there's at least some anecdotes about children using those evening high schools as a pathway to attend college, although I don't know how common that was. The evening school movement gained greater momentum in the late 19th and early 20th century. So to put it in context, by 1890, it was about 1.2% of public school enrollment in the US. This doesn't sound like much at a national level, and it isn't, but more than half of the evening school students were located in 3 states: Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, so the northeastern part of the US. And in those cities, or in industrial cities in those states, it accounted for a large proportion of public school enrollment. So about a third in Harrison, New Jersey, about 25% in Paterson, New Jersey, and 11% in New York City. So they're actually quite common. And so it's surprising that they received so little attention in the literature. We can glean some information from many education committees reports, from documents from the city school systems. We can glean some information about who attended, mainly working class children and the children of immigrants. But we don't know a lot about the micro level, the individual basis for deciding whether or not to attend night schools. Fortunately, a very unique survey of working children in New Jersey helps to shed some light on that. So I put this image here. I know images with small print are so annoying. I don't mean for you to read these at all. I just want to give you kind of a feel for what the data look like. But these surveyors went into factories and other types of businesses looking for children that might be working. They would interview them and ask them questions. This was in 1903. There were 943 working children who participated, and they were aged 12 to 19. The survey included questions on their individual characteristics, their family, their working conditions. That was the purpose of the survey, was to try to figure out what the working conditions look like for children. But for my purposes, fortunately, they asked about the children's schooling, and it's one of the only surveys or the only survey I know of that asks about night school attendance. So we can't generalize the results from a survey at one point in time in New Jersey historically, but there are some key insights that I think are important. Even though evening schools lowered the opportunity cost, so of school attendance by allowing students to attend school without quitting their jobs, they could still contribute to their households. The availability of night schools didn't induce the majority of students children to take advantage of those school opportunities. In this survey, about 38% of the working children had attended evening school when they had access to the schools. The second thing that I think is important is that rather than just thinking about the availability of a school and automatically taking advantage of it, children really talked in these surveys about the importance of their earnings to the household income. That weighed heavily in their decision, as did the importance of their contribution to housework. So I am referring this because we noticed in the survey that, or I noticed in the survey that children whose mothers had passed away, all else equal, were much less likely to attend evening school. And this was really only for girls that were likely to be taking over some of those household duties for their mothers. Law enforcement appears to have been important in the children's decisions. So in industries that are well known for child labor, they are inspected frequently. Those children were much more likely to be attending night school. This was an avenue for complying with laws that existed in New Jersey at the time. In other types of businesses and industries, they were much less likely to have attended evening school. So that's at least consistent with a story for law enforcement to matter. And then lastly, the survey asked about some information about their educational outcomes, their self-reported literacy, numeracy, how well they could write. And having attended night school was at least associated with improved educational outcomes. I can't say something about the causality of that, but at least it's consistent with that story. Now, around the time that this survey was conducted, there was a massive shift in the nature of evening schools, the purpose, and in particular, there were child labor laws and compulsory education laws that were being passed, and we started to see better enforcement of the laws shortly after the turn of the century. And so there was less of a need for the elementary evening schools because children were required to remain in the school regardless of if they were working. The schools also started to play an even more important role in providing language classes, instruction in civics, citizenship classes for the children of immigrants. And then lastly, the schools started to focus on providing education for adults. The evening high schools, which had always had offerings in mechanical drawing, bookkeeping, dressmaking, these started to expand those offerings and really focus on that in light of some new federal funding that was available for schools at the time. So even though some of these changes started to take place around 1900, by World War I, there were various legislative changes that took place that caused this to be even more of a phenomenon, more of a shift, and the evening elementary schools faded away almost entirely. So given the stated objectives of the evening schools, mainly to draw more working children into the education system, this would resonate with most of the educators at the time. So it begs the question of why some cities decided to offer evening schools and others didn't, conditional on them being large enough to warrant this type of evening instruction or having child labor present. So to examine that, again, I have just a snapshot, not meant for you to read it, but a snapshot of what these data look like. So I have collected annual data from education reports. They would be constructed at the school level, which would be filtered up to the city, reported to the city level. The city would then compile education statistics and provide that to the state. And then the state education officials would provide that to the US government. And so these data are annual reports from that US, the Commissioner of Education, sorry, my brain just stopped working. Commissioner of Education that compiled that data and made it available for the public. So educators claimed that child labor, the extent of the immigrant population, the extent of overcrowding in the day schools mattered. They pointed toward using these schools as alternative for very crowded schools that couldn't be stretched more with the growing urbanization. Economic public choice theory says that typically when we think about community's decision whether or not they should provide education. The higher the income level of the community, the homogeneity of the population, that would determine how much the community wants to invest in education. But these these predictions are not really as clear in the presence of externalities. So meaning that if we think that education is desirable for certain groups, mainly because of the social impacts they will have on society in terms of crime and morals and things of that nature, then some of the standard predictions don't really hold any longer. And so I have to kind of rely on some of the historical narrative to guide the empirical work. Without getting into the details of that, there are some hoops to jump through in the analysis, because what the records indicated was that sometimes when a night school would open up in a city, then children would actually leave the day schools and go to work in the more formal labor market and attend evening school instead. And so because of the fact that there's this unclear connection between child labor and the availability of evening schools, that had to be taken into account. The key results here, the bottom line, is that it doesn't seem like it's just the exogenous differences in the number of children that are working that determined whether or not cities offered evening schools. Instead, it seems like it's more important how large the immigrant population was, how crowded the day schools were. That was driving some of these decisions, at least in a more definable way, a measurable way that we can identify. Ultimately, we're not just concerned with the political economy of why evening schools were available. We want to know about the impacts. How much do they improve the education outcomes of working children? And to get at that, I have to kind of think through what are some of the conceptual considerations here. So access to evening schools could improve literacy in some ways if it was easier for youths to attend in the evening so that they can attend more regularly, they can go to school and they would not have attended school otherwise. That could certainly provide an avenue to increase literacy. It's also possible that the more narrow focus of the curriculum, it was really focused on remedial reading and writing and helping children to get caught up in their studies. That could also promote literacy if the time in school was used more effectively. There's anecdotal evidence throughout all of these education reports that suggests that that's at least a possibility. Educators claimed it was a strong possibility. However, the schools were subject to a lot of criticism. Instead of regular attendance, there were reports that suggested that the schools had much worse attendance than the day schools. Some children would check out the new novel evening schools when they would open, and then they would drop out after a week or two. And so it's not clear that extensive margin was always effective. Evening school enrollment could just replace the day school enrollment, so we wouldn't see any change in literacy. And then the big criticism that is discussed throughout the primary data reports or records is tired students and tired teachers. The teachers, like as I mentioned, were drawn primarily from the day schools. So the second shift of teaching was very difficult on those teachers. And so in some places that was even not allowed. That didn't really solve the problem because the night school appointments were not very attractive teaching appointments. And so only the lowest quality teachers would usually volunteer for that sort of assignment. So here is my favorite picture from the night school era. And this is a lodging house, which was basically a charity home for working children. And as you can see, the street vendor is sleeping through his studies at the night school. So this concern was very legitimate. I analyze large samples of census data that are matched with the city level information that I mentioned before about the school system, the quality of the school system, and importantly for me, the availability of evening schools. The key results here were that not all of the evening school students were net additions to the city's public school rolls. So sometimes it really was the case that the evening schools were just crowding out or displacing the day school enrollment. And the availability of evening schools probably prompted some of the children in the community to enter the labor force where they would not have already. Now, that's not to say they wouldn't have worked. They may have worked in home production already, but it may have prompted them to enter the more lucrative labor force in the formal labor market. The availability of evening schools, even given all of that, does seem to have facilitated school attendance and improved literacy outcomes. And this is only found in the data for working children, so that lends some confidence to that finding. So some concluding thoughts, it's important to notice that in recent decades, that there have been many efforts to try to facilitate children and young adults in combining work and schooling, or just engaging in flexible schooling strategies. And so I think the US historical experience has something to offer there in terms of sharing that experience, but also it's important to note some of the differences as well. In terms of putting this in the broader context of US education movement, there is much work that is lauding the flexibility, adaptability of the early US education system. This was, it's believed that this set the US up for strong human capital in its early period, human capital development in its early period. And this flexibility can be seen by the fact that evening schools lowered the opportunity cost of education. In other words, it made it possible for children to continue their education without stopping their work. There was less resistance from parents, teachers, and employers, and it was possible despite overcrowding in the school. I think these last 2 points are important to think about with a critical eye, though. There were reports from observers that suggested that parents were very apathetic about their children's education in this time period. My reading of the history suggests that apathy was not necessarily the primary driver, that instead parents were either unaware of the benefits and returns to education. In some cases that was true, but more importantly, they were constrained by a need for the children's income to contribute to the household's well-being during this period of industrialization. The teachers' response to evening schools and their perceptions about it are fairly interesting to me, because teachers were very much in favor of the evening schools, provided they didn't have to teach them. There was a lot of disruption that was caused from the presence of working children who would go in and out of the day schools. If any of you teach classes where students are required to be there, you know that that is not a pleasant experience. So the teachers were pleased to have this opportunity to silo the students who were likely to create some difficulties and challenges in the classroom. They could silo them off in this other type of education system while still meeting their needs for education. Employers were also very excited about this, these schools. They were very much in favor. And this makes me a bit cautious, because employers are profit maximizers, and this, while perhaps altruistic motives were dominant, it appears that employers were very much in favor of these because they prevented much talk of enforcing and strengthening child labor and compulsory schooling laws that would disrupt their production. Lastly, there was a clear unwillingness to devote sufficient resources, tax resources, to providing schools. Schools were funded at the local and state level. And so there was a lack of willingness to devote enough resources to the education of children who were working, who were often the children of immigrants. And so again, I think that there were certainly altruistic motives driving the evening school movement, but I'm also cautious about interpreting that solely through the lens of altruism. In terms of current policy relevance, this is certainly still the case that the urban school districts in the US have used these types of flexible school strategies. I point towards Houston as an example that offers evening schools, but they're quite different than the historical context. They're meant for older students that have dropped out to return to schooling, or they are very close to dropping out. It allows them to recover credits and finish their high school education. And I also found some references to Mexico and Brazil that I thought were kind of interesting given the context. I don't know anything about these, so I have question marks here in case some of you have some insights on any parallels with the US experience. So for example, in Mexico during the late part of the 20th century, there was rapid growth in basic education. And at least this briefing was discussing the idea that this growth in enrollment was met through double shift schooling. So there were not enough resources in all cases to handle the rapid growth of enrollment. And so they used the existing schools, the existing infrastructure by introducing multiple shifts, including evening schools. In Brazil, there's even more of a consistent long history of this. At the time of this writing, this is around 2000. This is an Inter-American Development Bank report. They talk about 60% of students in upper secondary education are in night schools, mostly because they're working, but also they talk about this lack of space in the day schools as well as being important. So I think that the historical experience in the US suggests that evening schools can help working children to continue their education. But I also think that the historical narrative makes us a bit cautious about this. Contemporary critics of these educational alternatives today echo their historical counterparts. They're concerned about the quality of instruction and unintended consequences. At least in the US context, this unintended consequence that's looming is the development or the strengthening of a dual education system, one that benefits the middle class students and one that is designed for lower income students. And so that, coupled with all of the research that's coming out about the importance of sleep and the role of start times in education and how that affects children's well-being and their mental and physical health, all of that makes me a bit cautious. So I look forward to hearing some of your comments and any connections that you might see to the night studies more generally.
Thanks a lot, Linda. That was wonderful. Definitely nuances the romantic idea of nocturnal learning. It's we'll have the questions after the second presentation. So Nick Dunn, if you want to start, please go ahead.
Okay, I think we're there. Hello, everyone. I'm Nick Dunn from Lancaster University. So I'd just like to echo Linda's thanks as well to the Night Studies team for the opportunity to present today. I'm going to be talking about rethinking urban nights. So since the Enlightenment, Western culture has been intrinsically bound with ideas regarding illumination and a rather reductive worldview that doesn't necessarily account for the diversity of experiences that are apparent concerning darkness around the world. In the context of many Western cities, darkness is unwelcome. It's connected to negative cultural and historical associations alongside very, understandable perceptions of fear and crime. And as Brian Palmer has observed in his book, Cultures of Darkness, these beliefs and concerns were also metaphorically entwined to the night in the arts, a popular culture of purposeful but often derogatory construction and social criticism, which were always contrasted by the protections that light could offer. So, although predominantly Western in their origin, values of light, clarity, and cleanliness have since been transferred across the global experience of culture more widely. And I suggest that this is resulting in a worldwide decline of the nocturnal commons, to which urbanization has significantly contributed and somewhat damaged our relationship with darkness. Meanwhile, in his book 24/7, Jonathan Crary explores some of the paradoxes of the expanding non-stop life world of 21st century capitalism, paradoxes that are inseparable from shifting configurations of sleep and waking, illumination and darkness, justice and terror, and from forms of exposure or perhaps unprotectedness, vulnerability. One of these conditions can be characterized as a general inscription of human life into a phase without breaks. This idea of continuous functioning, which, as we've just seen from Linda's presentation, doesn't quite happen for human beings. So, although many organizations in the developed world have been running 24/7 for decades now, it's only recently that the elaboration, the modeling of one's personal and social identity with smartphones and the digital connectivity has been reorganized to conform a sort of uninterrupted operation of markets, information networks and systems. And so those seemingly irreducible necessities of human life, hunger, thirst, sexual desire, and perhaps recently the need for friendship, have been remade into commodified or financialized forms. Of course, no individual can ever be shopping, gaming, working, blogging, downloading, or texting 24/7. But since no moment, place, or situation now exists in which one cannot shop, consume, or exploit network resources, there's a kind of relentless incursion of the non-time of 24/7 into many aspects of social or personal life. And so a different spatial configuration of the usage of the night has emerged. And I think before the pandemic, a site such as this, we can see here in this fantastic image, whereas Wright's painting that we saw in the earlier slide of the factory windows illuminated by the oil lamps that allowed work to proceed continuously through the Industrial Revolution. Here, the 20th century image, not so dissimilar, except here the windows are lit with the glow of TV sets, and then maybe towards the end of the 20th century, it's the office block with windows lit by computer screens. But in all these cases, there's a transformational relationship between a deployment of a light source and the social construction of time. This is my home city, Manchester, where I'm talking from today, a few years ago. And the urban night has often been framed, developed, and performed in a very different manner to the activities of the daytime. This is a recurring theme, which I know sort of the night studies team is examining and looking at. And this can take many forms in this idea of freedom, but it's often framed as a form of pleasure seeking. And the expectation of pleasure is a counterpoint and somewhat acts in opposition to daytime activities, which are generally understood as relating to everyday worlds of labor, business, and finance. But we also know that everyday activities, shopping, going to the gym, have gradually expanded into the early morning and late into the evening. And scenes such as this one shown here, which has been compared to a Renaissance painting in its composition, though it was just a photographer taking a picture opportunistically, weirdly seems like a distant memory now, because the coronavirus pandemic has meant through various forms of lockdown, restrictions and curfew, we might not actually have an urban night quite like this anymore. But that doesn't mean that the practices of consumption have stopped, they've just changed, often through cultures of convenience, further precarious forms of work, deliveries, online things. And this has expanded the possibilities of night and also the ability of people to increasingly ask for services and goods that other people, of course, have to work for. Enmeshed in the ongoing processes of globalization are those kind of networks that support collective life. And artificial light is one of those, although it has lots of unintended consequences. The dominant narrative of savings in economic terms through the implementation of energy efficient lamps, however, I think is problematic in at least two ways. Firstly, the focus on economic value largely obscures all of the costs to the environment, humans, and non-humans. And secondly, to date, the deployment of further efficient artificial lighting methods has actually resulted in higher increasing levels of brightness at night. So it's not answered the question it was supposed to do. And this, this artificial illumination is altering natural cycles of light and dark. It's impacting on the circadian rhythms of human and non-human bodies, flora and their ecosystems. So integral to this increase is the loss of nocturnal atmospheres. Our access to darkness becomes further limited. And this is to do with the quantity and the quality of different forms of artificial light employed. This example you can see here, even how the night is represented remains highly controversial. And Sarah B. Pritchard's written a wonderful discourse about how this composite image supposedly showing the Earth at night is quite problematic. So how do we think about the cost of light? I mean, exposure to light after dusk is quite literally unnatural and it's detrimental to health. Hong Kong, as you can see here, is often touted as the world's most light polluted city. Its bright sky symbolizes prosperity and its nickname is the Pearl of the Orient. So a lot of the people assume this is this image or this type of image is a badge of honor, something to aspire to, maybe rather than considering what the implications of all this brightness are. And for example, a consistent estimate is that around 30% of all outdoor lighting in the US is wasted. That translates to about 73 million megawatt hours of electricity that's just gone, and an estimated cost of about $63 billion a year. In terms of carbon dioxide, that's the equivalent of removing 9.5 million cars from the road. And the European Union, similar estimates, the costs are about 5.2 billion annually. So how did we get up? How did we end up here? How did we get to a point where this is desirable for how we want our cities to be? I mean, ever since we found the many benefits of living together in settlements, humankind has sought to evolve different forms of organization and cohabitation. So kind of parallel to a history of civilization is the history of cities and ways of envisioning collective futures. And in the present time, they've done a lot of work on how cities are represented, future cities. These either favor optimism, technology for the betterment of society, or pessimism, where usually undisclosed forms of ecocide have occurred. And this kind of polarization runs deep. I mean, many smart cities, for example, this one here, these promote green and blue, untainted environments. They imply freshness, cleanliness, health and safety, but they're frictionless futures where everything integrates seamlessly and effortlessly. And by contrast, where darkness is present in such visions is typically used to shape the depiction of a foreboding future. It's dystopic, it's dirty, and it's dangerous. And I appreciate this can be really exciting for fictional narratives, but the impact and influence of these kind of gloomy places tends to reinforce the negative associations of darkness. And there's an important point to be made about this kind of imagery. Visions for place, whether fictional or not, carry and project concepts and ideologies that are behind them. And in doing so, they're not neutral because what they omit can be significant as what they promote. So is it possible that other options of how we might think about darkness are being hidden from us or not being discovered? After all, this issue is not limited to science fiction, but also occurs in fact-based imagery like the NASA example I showed earlier. To reimagine how our places might be at night, we might need compelling visions for the future. Now, this photocomposite image here from the Darkened Cities series by photographer Thierry Cohen form a vision of global cities without electricity. I'm not suggesting this is where we should go and where we should head it, but I think it's interesting because these images encourage us to perhaps reflect on our reliance upon man-made infrastructures and perhaps point towards future cities where we reconnect to some extent with darkness through more responsible and less environmentally impactful ways of living. What does this mean for the future? Why should we reassert the value of darkness and question the loss of access to the nocturnal commons, particularly in urban centres? Oh, excuse me. Well, it's important to state that, you know, this kind of loss, this inability perhaps to see the starry night sky in a city, it's not absolute, but the direct experience of that is likely to be obstructed or at least hindered by the profusion of LED street lighting. And it's important to emphasize here that despite many cities' attempts to have a comprehensive installation of new lighting across a city, as with many strategies that seek to establish a total and uniform environment, they very rarely produce a coherent landscape at night. And this is because the planned power of completeness is an illusion. You know, the lighting technology is built over and responds to a much longer history of partial infrastructures and contextual characteristics that shape its effects. And this street scene was taken a couple of months ago by me, but it's not that dissimilar, I guess, from quite a lot of Western cities. We see a mishmash of different lighting technologies and effective atmospheres. So we can see the history in some ways through images like this, that difference still persists or reasserts itself, albeit in ways that are perhaps unforeseen and unintended. So I guess the angle I'm pushing here is that understanding darkness is worth pursuing alongside efforts to reduce the negative impacts of artificial lighting at night is important in how we might direct us towards a different way of approaching value in urban spaces at night. Critical to understanding urban nights in the work I've been doing is trying to acknowledge the dynamic qualities of the elements that form and shape them in material, spatial, and temporal terms. The potentialities and capacities of nocturnal ambiances to provide a wide array of sensations and interactions that are often currently present needs kind of methods to rediscover and reimagine our relationships with darkness. And for me personally, I'm trained as an architect and now work more in urban design. I think this is where design can provide a valuable role. You know, we need new visions and interventions for urban nights, shared nocturnal atmospheres that promote positive behavior for human and, you know, more than human sensitivities to be designed with darkness rather than against it. And this is a place in Manchester, not too far from where I am now, where I take people as part of some tours. So giving equal consideration to the value of darkness, I think can contribute to urban nights rather than simply attempting to reduce the effects of light pollution. But we've got to engage with those decision-making processes. And I have been exploring that by taking people out and showing them different places so they can experience firsthand those different qualities of urban space, you know, that are perhaps less well lit than we might expect. Also in Glasgow, 2017 and 2018, I've been leading a series of night walks in Scotland with architects, urban designers, policymakers, city councillors, and members of the public to show how we might reimagine the city after dark. And, you know, we've been finding and exploring collaborative ways in which Glasgow can be transformed from the concrete city we know in the day to an entity that its future almost, that we glimpse fleetingly at night. So walking and talking, there was about 120 people on this night walk to look and discuss the significance of nighttime design in the rethinking of Glasgow's public realm. It's been a really rich conversation, and it's led to further advocacy work to think about how we might design urban nights more inclusively. I mean, positioning darkness as a positive agent for design, I think brings forth a need to better understand the value of different coexistences of light and dark, you know, their qualities, effects, so that we can understand more options. I think our options are quite limited at the moment. So to rethink urban nights, we might also need to think what nocturnal design values are, what's desirable and for whom. You know, I mean, these things get obviously contested, so that underrepresented or perhaps excluded people in these decision-making and discussion processes are engaged. We've also been doing some work at Lancaster at trying to understand the nocturnal biome, you know, the more than human ecology of urban nights. What else is going on apart from the human activity? And so an increasing element of the last few years of my documentation of the Manchester City region's nightscapes has been trying to account for the nocturnal kin, if you will, in such places. So although you can't really see them in this image here, this moody image, there's also Canada geese, a dog walker, a security guard, and swans present in there. So it's, again, you know, it's not just about the human being the user of the night that perhaps we could think through. And so this work's it's very much in progress, trying to demonstrate different ways that we can perhaps shape, frame, and articulate positive urban nights that promote a better understanding of darkness, and perhaps avoid scenes like this where you have really overlit residual space that doesn't really form any function in the city. It's left over. And so the purpose of this is really to provide alternatives, you know, to try and offer deliberate positive counterpoints to the prevailing practices of designing against darkness. And, you know, as part of this discussion today, really, it's an open invitation to those listening, and hopefully we're going to have a rich discussion next about how we might rethink urban nights as a multi and interdisciplinary network of theory and practice, and the pressing need for the arts, humanities, and social sciences to engage in new ways to reimagine our relationships with darkness and better understand the alternatives for artificial lighting that enable humans, non-humans, and the planet to flourish. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nick. That was wonderful, very inspiring. I guess there will be many questions. I definitely have questions, but I don't want to seem to use my privilege as a host. So, does anybody want to ask a question? Also, you can definitely ask questions in the chat. I'll read them. So feel free to take the microphone now. Maybe one of my colleagues want to start. I don't know. Yes, Will. Por favor.
Thanks to both of you for great presentations. Linda, I'm curious about night schools in terms of differences between seasons where it's very light outside at night and where it's dark, and also regions where that happens. And I mean, I just know, you know, people who try and do night school where the sun is out in the evening find it very difficult in places like parts of Canada, all of Canada, where it's very dark during the winter. The people, you know, talk about, we might as well go to night school. There's nothing else to do. I just wonder if there's a seasonality that enters into the planning or the experience or even the kind of affect of going to night school.
So that's a great question. The places where I see that come up in the historical record is mainly related to thinking about, especially in the colonial times, there's a lot written about the importance of evening school, but only in the winter or fall when it's not the planting and harvest season, you know, so that the workers weren't able to be out and working quite as many hours. And I don't know the extent to which that applied in the urban settings for the public schools quite as much. There was certainly a lot of concern, mostly directed towards females, thinking about their safety at night. And so those would have been exacerbated in the parts of the year when the dark begins earlier in the day. But with the progression of, you know, street lamps and those types of things, that I think probably enabled the schools to continue. The fact that There was not a lot of work for children at night, quite as much as in the daytime. There were some exceptions to that rule, but many of the factory employment and so forth would be during the day. So that helped, I think, to counteract the limitation on the times of the day in different seasons. But it was certainly an issue that I heard a lot about or read a lot about with respect to agricultural communities and thinking about schooling. Their school structure was always organized around the work of the children, which was very seasonal in nature. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Also, if you have questions in Spanish or in French, it's completely okay. You can ask them in the chat, and we will translate them. Edna, yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Nick. That was really, really nice. I learned a lot of things, and maybe I have two little questions. Linda, I'm thinking about the schedules. Do you know what time they begin the school and at what time they ending to study? I don't know, maybe 8 p.m. until 12 p.m. Maybe it's the same right now?
So in the historical context, there was so much variation that there's no possible way to give a, this is the standard time. Some of the evening schools in the historical context would start as early as 5 p.m. and go as late as 10 p.m. I think was 10 or 10:30. That was definitely the latest that I saw mention of it, but there was not just a one size fits all solution for the timing of the schools historically. In the more current context, I only know very little about that in the US, but I should say that it's just very decentralized is the problem. Yes. With just saying general things, but I think the timing is fairly similar in the US. I'm thinking of schools in Houston that will operate. They tend to not start as early as 5. There's a perception that right now that's still the work day at 5. They would tend to be maybe starting at 6 or 7 until 9. That would be a more common time frame in the current setting. But in the historical context, there was kind of a wide range of times across cities. So
yeah. It's really interesting. Thank you. Because you're talking about evening school and also night schools. It's evening. Maybe in
So I use those terms interchangeably. There's at least I never came across instances where it would be night, as in starting at 8 or 9 o'clock at night and going well into the midnight hours. I didn't come across those examples, not to say they didn't exist, but it would usually be evening. So certainly dark during much of the year when this is happening, but definitely not the middle of the night. So.
Thank you. I have a little question for Nick, and after I take up. Thank you, Nick. I appreciate a lot of your image. I take it was great. I like a lot of when you're talking about the cost of night, because we use a lot of the artificial illumination, and I would like to know about your nocturnal walks. How do you make for keeping touch with the people who participate, and then what do you do for trying to change something? Because we make the same thing here, but after the nocturnal walks, we do it, and after we don't do it anymore thing. Do you know? I don't know if it's there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Edna. It's a great question. And I think what you're hinting at there, perhaps unintentionally, is the difficulty of any form of public engagement and sustaining. So what I usually do when I start research is immediately try and think about the fire escape and how I can design myself out of it. Because if I have to be there for this to be successful, then it's probably not great public engagement, because they need to be able to carry it on. But in the first instance, for the work in Glasgow, for example, we got in touch with, I got in touch with the Avenues project, which is looking at working through and redesigning all the main thoroughfares in the city and reconsidering those. So they already have a number of stakeholders, so we could contact those groups as well as other community groups and bring them together in mixtures perhaps that they hadn't experienced before. And everybody knew that, so we used a very simple online form to sign up. Afterwards, there was a series of those events. Afterwards, we would have discussion groups which could be focused. Again, people were invited to go to those. We also, I handed the baton over, I suppose, because the point here was that I'm not leading the groups and the expert of the night. I'm there to learn about people's experiences so that I can think about how we might work through it. And I think there's a danger sometimes in these processes that people can see you in a certain way, which is unhelpful both for them and for you, actually. So I tended to move around the groups as we walk through. I mean, as I say, on one stage it was about 120 people. And we asked them to then curate a series of walks which they led, and sometimes I went on and sometimes I didn't. And that's carried on a much smaller set of activities, I must say. There's not the same number of peoples, but that's carried on with an engagement, and they're still feeding into those processes in the city. So that's how that's had a sense of legacy, if that's the right word, but it's difficult.
Thank you. Yes, sure.
Well, thank you for both presentations. I have a question also for each one of you. Nick, there's a strong connection between security, night security and light. That if you light the night, it's more secure and people feel safe where there's light. Have you think of different ways of engaging with night to create a security sense that is not connected to light?
Yes, one of the barriers I think that and I'm sure other people I know, other people who are listening today have encountered, is the perceived danger of the night and of darkness. And so if I invite people to come out with me, they feel safe. Why? I mean, I appreciate you can't see my stature, but I'm not someone that you would necessarily feel particularly safe with, you know, if you're walking down the street. But this is the problem of expertise, you see, that people think, oh, well, if he goes out all the time and he does these walks, then it's totally fine to be with him. I guess what we've been looking at is the empowering qualities of collective movement through spaces and places at night that changes the characteristic and allows you to have lower levels. I'm not talking about total darkness here, but to have nuance and variation in light. Here in the UK, light is deployed to really sharpen inequalities. Social housing is often either brightly lit, because it's a form of surveillance that's fairly cheap. It stops people doing things, or it's incredibly poorly lit, which we can see also in the history of urban development, that poorer communities were often not attended to and benefited from the bright lights of the urban centre, if you like, and commerce. So a lot of this has been about collective action, really, and encouraging people to experience those things firsthand, to try and not work through, but think through and physically walk through those perceptions.
Okay, thank you. Linda, I have one comment. I think it's very interesting this, how day saturates our time. So we have to go overnight to create other opportunities that are parallel to our daily lives. I don't know if I'm being clear on this, but I think I mean, many questions came to me, the possibility of doing research now in this direction in terms of how night can complement our lives in terms of creating alternatives. And I'm thinking, of course, of education, formal education, but also how now young adults or people in general are using cyber or virtual classrooms or taking courses at night that they can, increase their skills in what they're doing or starting new careers. But in this individual, out of this infrastructure and in their own homes, using their houses, their computers to learn and to prepare in different ways and complement what they're doing at day. I think that's an interesting area of research.
Yeah, and I think it's so much more timely and crucial than it would have been 2 years ago, or a little over a year ago, with so much of the world thrust into learning, being kind of forced to learn some of the technology and be exposed to technology that allows them to take better advantage of those opportunities. So I don't think it could possibly be more timely. So yeah, thank you. I think that's a wonderful point too.
Somebody else has a question, maybe? I was wondering, Linda, if there was any maybe more qualitative data regarding these evening schools in the in novels, or in, I don't know, if is it something that we can find in fiction, or in other kind of areas?
Yeah, I would love to know the answer to that. I am a wide reader. I love to read. I usually have 2 or 3 books going at once, fiction, nonfiction, but lots of fiction. I have not come across these mentioned in works of fiction. I certainly, from time to time, just looking at, education, alternative education in general, not just night schools. I'm fairly passionate about thinking about that. I was someone who went through a very strange progression through education, leaving school early, going back for education later. And so I noticed these mentions of, schools that are operated in, there's a school called the Barefoot Schools in India. And so I'll hear about nonprofits operating these schools, but all in the kind of real world context, and usually just a mention of it, that this is going on, this is, something that is happening, but not much analysis, not much, I would love to find some historical mentions of this in novels, but I have not encountered anything that I recall mentioning it. So,
right. I had this romantic, or maybe idea from maybe, but I cannot recall what movie where you can see someone that has a very hard day life, working and going to school at night, and I can see, I can feel that it's something that we see in many movies, but I cannot recall any of them. Mm-hmm. So, but
and I certainly see movies. I couldn't name one right this moment, but I certainly see movies where it's night school for community college, those types of adult learners. I certainly see that mentioned in movies and books and things of that nature, but not so much for the working children or youths. So I think it would be fantastic and fascinating to see some of that and see if there are some mentions in literature, especially in the US, where it was, it was so common in certain areas that I feel like it has to be mentioned by someone, but I just haven't discovered those references.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Will, for sharing this this link. I didn't know about that movie. Actually, maybe for people that are following us on YouTube, Will made a comment. Linda, this made me think as well of the debates over the introduction of daylight savings time, which involved in part the claim that it would encourage young people to be outside, engaged in healthy sporty activities in early evening.
Yeah, I saw that comment, and that's kind of fascinating given some of the realities of what happened in communities that introduced night schools. So there was an active nightlife already in most of these places, aside from just working night shifts and things like that, of course, but there was a lot of recreation that would happen late in the evenings. This is when you would have political speakers hold, discussions or rallies is what we would think of it now. There would be entertainment options in the evenings in most of these cities in the late 1800s, early 1900s in the US. And so it's not clear to me whether I don't hear mention of sort of outdoor activity that school was displacing, but it's certainly something that in a more modern context, if evening recreation was the alternative activity in the evening for some of the young people, that might be something that might be displacing those healthy activities. So I think that's a really fascinating comment. In the US, I think daylight savings, it was used sporadically, in a more historical context, but it really wasn't standardized across the US till the 60s, 1960s. So I think it would certainly be very relevant to keep in mind for updating and thinking more in the modern perspective. So yeah, I love that comment. Thank you. Thank you.
Another comment from Jess Rea. Well, thank you both of you for your great presentations. And so Linda, you mentioned evening schools in Brazil. The country's legal working age is 16 or 14 as an apprentice, and school is mandatory between ages 6 and 14. Evening schools are an option for working young folks, and it's determined by class, low-income students, mostly offered by the public education system, both rural and urban areas. An exception is private schools offering evening night preparatory courses for higher education mission. Brazil also used to have a successful adult literacy program, usually in the evening night.
So I would love to know just if you know of the context of Brazil about the driving force for those schools being offered. So is there any sense that overcrowding, that this is to me, looking at double shift or triple shift schooling, it seems like a great use of existing resources when there are challenges in expanding the educational infrastructure. And so I'm so curious if you know in Brazil if that was kind of a driving force as well, or was it solely to meet the needs of the working children for letting them combine work and schooling? So Jess, I don't know if you have any knowledge of that, but I'm very, very interested.
Thanks, Linda. Actually, not really. It's not what I study. Like on a personal note, both my parents attended evening night schools in the 60s and 70s during the dictatorship. My father worked in the countryside, like in the farms, and attended school in the village in the evening. And my mom in an urban area as a factory worker since she was 14. So yeah, they had this experience of the night school, and but things changed a lot. They still offer evening and night education, mostly in public school. It's quite common, but if you have, let's say, the privilege or access to private education, it's seen as something quite good to have full-time education during the day. Like, it makes all the difference, and then you have like access to all these courses, different perspectives on everything, and staying in school throughout the entire day seems like a class privilege in the country for sure when I was growing up. And I know like there are like so many studies about this, and about specifically, you mentioned the youth and adult literacy programs in the US. I have no idea how this works there. We still do have, and during the day, but mostly at night too, if you had to skip education, mostly because of work, you have the chance to catch up, and there's no age limit to have access to education for free later on when you're 40, 50, 60. And it's mostly an evening/night thing in the country. I don't know if this answers very much, but it's an interesting structure. We still have this, and it's still offered for sure.
So that evening adult education, just to make sure I heard you right, that is free, that is offered to adults as part of the public system. That's amazing. That's so interesting. Thank you. Thanks for sharing those perspectives and experiences with your family. I just get the sense from brief references that that evening schools are important in Brazil, but that much of the literature that I happen to have come across was in Portuguese. So,
yes, I know. Yeah, that's an issue with
I haven't had the chance to delve in very deeply to it. So thank you so much. Thanks.
Yes, Yolanda.
Hi, first, thank you, both of you, for your presentations. They were very interesting. I have a question for each. For Linda, I have been reading these different news about night schools, especially for elementary schools, that have been popping up in the pandemic. And the driving force is that the kids need parental supervision and this kind of companionship and attention. And I think it's very interesting how this driving force has switched from your presentation, right? So instead of the idea of labor and literacy, here is the idea of the parents being there for the kids. So if you have read about it or you have any ideas about it, I'm very interested on what you think. And yes, if you could.
So I think that's pretty fascinating. I had just started to discover some of that information in recent weeks as it's gotten highlighted in news articles. And I think that really speaks to the point that Alejandra made about the changing technologies that and expanding opportunities for these productive and positive activities in the night space. And I think that's certainly one of them. And I think with respect to these, they talk about nighttime kindergartens is sometimes what they'll call them, or, but it certainly is not just kindergarten children. It's, elementary age and especially that need all of the supervision. I think that is such a fantastic option for families to have. My worry with not just the evening component, but the at-home distance learning, that technology, one of the challenges I think is that it's wonderful to have the parents to be able to devote the supervision and the help with homework and the guidance that the kids need. But working with low-income communities here in Waco, where I am, I know I hear so much concern and lack of preparation and the feeling of inadequacy of many parents for being able to take advantage of those opportunities. So I hope that those evening opportunities for education at the elementary level using technology, I hope that those opportunities expand. But I think at least in the context here right now, I'm hoping that there will be greater attention to helping the low-income families to come along with that, to make those opportunities available for their kindergartners and their young students. I don't know how that works, and I don't know any solution for that, but that's the first thing that kind of comes to mind. So, but I think it's fantastic that there, in most cases, flexibility in education seems to me a great advantage, giving people more options. I look forward to seeing efforts to address the social justice part of that too. So thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. And for Nick, I think it's very interesting and very inspiring the notion of this kind of nocturnal ecosystem that includes the human and the non-human. So if you could please explore that idea a little further.
Sure, great. That's a great challenge, Yolanda. It's kind of what we're trying to do, but I haven't got the answers for you all today. I mean, we have been creating different ways of measuring and recording the sounds, but also the light levels in urban places, sort of 24 hours and longer, you know, weeks, months, and being able to compare those and see what kind of activity there is. I mean, of course, cities have all kinds of wildlife, flora and fauna, which varies from place to place. And it's interesting, the idea of more than human, because we might then think that some species are desirable, possibly, you know, foxes, some are less desirable, rats, you know, possibly pigeons. And so this starts to sort of bring in a whole idea about preferable, I suppose. But we've been looking really because, as I tried to explain a little bit, a lot of the visions for place, they're nearly always shown in the daytime. They're clean, green, you know, beautiful places, and the environmental benefits of those designs, so the various tree canopies and treescapes that may go through a city, the water features, the canals, the rivers, experiencing those things in the daytime is perhaps of more benefit to us as a species. But those infrastructures and those kind of characteristics that can be integrated into you know, an urban centre and landscape are often more beneficial to other species at night because they provide safe navigation and safe passageway. So we've been trying to, what we're doing at the moment, we set up a dark design lab, which is really allowing us to create these different things to go out at the night and try and measure these things. And at the moment, it's just circumstance, it's accident, not by design. The fact that we're in a second lockdown at the moment is bringing us some really interesting findings about how the city is being reclaimed by non-human bodies, because there are more precarious workers, more delivery type workers on bike couriers, that kind of thing. But the general kind of buzz that you might get in a relatively small city like Manchester is just kind of gone because it isn't there. You know, it's just restricted to key workers. So we're really trying to think through what more than human design might mean for our cities, and that includes nights as well as days.
Thank you, Nick. That's so interesting.
Nick, do you know any example of cities that reduced light at night? Because I mean, what you said about this idea of light related to the idea of progress was very true, I think, and I was wondering if there was any initiative already functioning.
There are, yes, there are a number of places, and you're connected to the International Dark Sky Association is the Dark Sky Towns Initiative. Now, usually these are places that are in proximity to where you would hope to see starry night skies, so they don't tend to be busy urban centres. There have been pilot projects in places like Delft, Amsterdam, also Copenhagen, where they've tried districts. You've probably heard of greenouts as well, where cities, you know, have voluntarily sort of dimmed their lights. They've not turned them out completely. So people are trying it around the world. The big barrier for this, I think, in a way, is cultural, because we tend to think of darkness still as being dangerous, possibly regressive. You know, it's not seen as a progression. Why would you want to go back to that? And I think there's some work that needs to be done, really, about showing that beyond a lot of light might be incrementally a little bit more darkness, which would be beneficial for us actually as a species, but also the people we share it is. But of course, darkness is situated, it's plural, and it's relational, you know, and so my experience of it is different from people gathered here. And I also understand, you know, in the same way that urban space is often gendered and racialized explicitly or implicitly, there are also problems with lowering light levels in urban places. So it's a really knotty problem, and that's why I haven't got an answer. It's just, I think there's going to be a lot of work going on here at the moment. But there are a lot of cities trying different initiatives at the moment.
Thank you. Yes, Will, please.
Well, just, I mean, to follow on from Nick's comment, which is covers most of it, but MICHAEL, it's, you know, when I do searches on the night that come in every day for months of this year, it's mostly been small cities in France turning off their lights. And then finding out that, well, people want the lights back on because they think in the context of lockdown, why would we need the lights? Then they find that people makes the lights being off even more depressing. It completely ruins urbanity. It creates a sense of insecurity, but there's just, you know, there are 15 towns and cities in France that have tried this over the last year. In many cases, exploiting the context of COVID to do what they've been wanting to do for some time. So anyways.
Thank you, Will. Yes, Soledad, you want to speak, please?
Yes, hello, how are you doing? Thank you, Linda and Nick, for your presentations. I would like to ask a question to what Alejandro has asked before to Nick, and that's regarding the gender perspective. If you have been researching about the association between light and security from a gender perspective, or do you know any literature regarding that? And besides, I would like to tell Linda something very little that I know about night schooling in Argentina, at least in Buenos Aires. While I was hearing your presentation, I tried to get some information regarding that. And I discovered that night schooling has been part of our schooling systems since 1894, and it was considered as part of adults' education. Besides, my personal experience is that in the 90s and the 2000s, night schooling was for one of the most characteristic was the mixed generation, the intergenerational experience. So there were teenagers besides adult peoples. And something else is that in 2018, the local government from Buenos Aires City, the capital of the country, tried to close evening schools, but they couldn't because there was a very big resistance from the public opinion. So in 2019, they went back with that decision.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing that perspective.
Yes. Great question. I have not personally been researching the city or night from looking at the gender issues. So I'm aware of them. I could not be because in the end I'm a white, sadly increasingly middle-aged male when I go out at night. So you know, I'm quite aware of those things. What has been interesting though is that when I have spoken of my experiences or met with people, and there have been quite appropriately, I should say, challenges. Well, you know, but you say this as a guy that's walking at night, sometimes alone. You know, a woman would never do that. There have been challenges in those situations where actually people have come forward and said, well, actually, as a female critical geographer or whatever, I do that. And there are, you know, a growing number of people that seem to be going out and engaging with those practices, but it's not my area of expertise, and I wouldn't pretend it to be in terms of that. But you know, there are increasing literature, obviously, on the bias, the gender bias of data. You know, and this has formed popular books, and you've probably seen things like Invisible Women, and also, you know, recent book last year, The Feminist City, and how cities are designed. But again, that has a lot of personal perspective in it rather than empirical evidence. But there is increasing work, but I'm sure much work to be done.
Thank you, Nick. Actually, the next session of the seminar in February will be about gender, so that's perfect, I guess. It's already on the blog. Yes, speaking of which, if you want to join the network, please subscribe to the mailing list. It's here in the chat. We still have time for a few questions, so if anyone wants to participate, please feel free. Just checking. Did someone raise the hand? Yes, Geraldine.
Hi, everyone. Do you listen to me? Yeah.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that in Sweden and also I think in Mexico, but mostly in Sweden, I know there are these groups that when you go out, a group of women or you don't feel safe, there is like this kind of brigades of women and also guys that volunteer and they can help you go back or they accompany you in the bike or whatever to go back. And I guess in other cities are, but in Sweden, I'm pretty sure because I have seen them outside the clubs. You just like call them. And in Mexico City, there is also a group that I read one. So maybe just interesting to look at that because I think those brigades to accompany, to help, to go with women walking at night or taking home are very interesting and useful.
Thank you. At least from what I know, in France, the night councils they do try to have these meetings with light designers that are aware of this whole impact that we have on the animals and the nature in general. And these meetings, they try to make them dialogue or to create dialogue with feminist associations that are part of the night councils to find actually sort of a new way to think about all these issues, like this idea of a global perspective on light at night. And I don't know what are the results, but I guess that's a good start. Anyone else wants to say something, ask something? Maybe I had just one doubt about Linda's presentation about the role of law enforcement. I'm not sure I understood what was the role of them.
So I think it comes into play in a couple of places. So when thinking about like providing the evening schools, as soon as a law would be passed that seemed to be enforceable. This was a huge problem with child labor legislation, compulsory schooling education. Sometimes it would be on the books, but it would be inconsistent with each other. It would not be enforced. But to the extent that it was enforced, as soon as a law would be passed, you would see the employers in a region start to scramble to try to comply with it in the least costly way. So offering a night school in the factory that could comply with the letter of the law without having the children be unable to come and work. They would perhaps do it in between shifts, on a break, you know, those types of things to comply, or they would even set up the schools slightly outside of the factory if it wasn't possible to have it inside. So that's one aspect. The other one, which is probably what caught your attention, was thinking about when children are going to attend night school, that small data set that looked at working children in New Jersey. And so there was wide differences or very big differences in the enforcement across industries. And so not just enforcement of the law, period, but there were certain industries that were very well known. Textiles would be one. They were very well known for hiring children because of the nimble hands argument. They could get in the machines and do things that adult hands couldn't. And so they were some of the most common employers of children. And so any children who are working in those industries, in the survey at least, not to say this applied to everyone, but for that particular survey, they were much more likely to, if they worked in an industry that was subject to a lot of monitoring, they were much more likely to have gone to evening school at some point. And spent longer. It looked at the months that they would attend. So it appeared at least consistent with a story that kids working in those industries were encouraged, required to comply with the laws through attending night schools. So that is kind of interesting in and of itself, just because there was such lax enforcement of law and inconsistent enforcement. So it's kind of interesting in and of itself, but it also gives some insight into the idea that not every child would just jump at the chance to go to evening school. It really was pockets of children who would want to take advantage of this. And I'm sure some of that had to do with their circumstances at work and their time constraints. But I think some of it had to do with the legal environment as well.
Thank you. Maybe one last comment regarding the Mexican case, and it's a personal experience. But when I arrived here in Mexico 10 years ago to study, I was very impressed by this double shift. And I mean, you could really see at the university the morning groups versus the afternoon, evening groups, which were way more, I don't know how to say, relaxed. I don't know. And actually, the last class was until 10. Was from 8 to 10 p.m. And I remember this last class was like surrounded by myths and legends, you know, like there was like this idea of going to the last class and getting out so late, and I don't know, it was actually, it was a philosophy class. It was very mystical. So there was like a whole thing about this evening courses, and it's something that I had never seen in France, for instance. So I was very impressed by that. But this is just like a small, maybe a feeling about how it happened in Mexico. But I don't know the reason and the driving force for this. But yeah.
I feel like there might be something there that is a more general kind of idea about, you know, thinking about Nick's work and thinking about the brigades of women and other people in the community that would get together and sort of make the effort to reclaim the night. And, you know, I think this is kind of a different lens on that, but it seems like it is another example of some way that there's a special community that can form in these times that are unusual, and that kind of wake us up and make us look at things from a different perspective or experience things out of the norm. So I don't know, hearing you talk about that kind of makes me think that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the library at night experience is definitely something, and museum, I guess. So yeah, definitely. And I know that opening museums at nights, it's definitely something that is going on, at least in Europe with the night councils. They try to promote this vision of the night that is not only about parties and clubs. It's also about culture, and so museums and places like that are maybe let's say they try to open them at night, but not every night. It's something like they're working on.
And with the workday, at least I know this is true in the US, I am guessing it's true in other places, but the traditional workday hours kind of stretching longer and longer. And so I get really excited when I hear about those I don't know, opportunities to have that sense of community and things that are not just, you know, solely set aside for the day, but enabling people to come together in new and different ways in the evening too. So.
And it's definitely a topic now with the coronavirus crisis, because I mean, if the aim is to have people not being concentrated in one place. I mean, the night is actually the perfect time to spread all the people that could go to a museum or another activity. So I'm always a bit sad when I see that the night is always like the first thing that they shut down. But well, that's just personal perspective. So I guess if there is no more question, we can stop this session here. Thanks a lot to both of you. It was wonderful. I'm very happy to start this year with this session. So we'll have the next session in February, the 18th of February. So please join us. We'll be having sessions every month, more or less. And thanks for being here today. And well, see you soon, I guess.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you to you. Alejandro,
Thank
you want to say
everyone.
something?
Please, if you want to be in our mailing list, leave us your email in the chat. And todos los que quieran estar en el correo del seminario, por favor, déjenos su email en el chat. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.